Hi, my name is Rebecka Sofia Ahvenniemi. In this video I will give you a presentation on the philosophy of music as a discipline, some of the main discussions of this field, and I will make many suggestions for further reading. The lecture is exactly 112 minutes in length. It was supposed to be 100 minutes, but I did not know where to cut, so we can consider the 12 minutes a bonus. Whether you are a musician, an academic, or just interested in knowing about the philosophy of music in general, I hope that this video can give you some tools to navigate this field. The speed of this video is fast, so you may want to pause it and make notes along the way if something comes up that you find interesting and you want to dive deeper into later by yourself. I have also made a handout, a PDF, with all the sources mentioned in this video, which you will get access to from the link down below. If you want the PDF but you do not want to be on my email list, you can unsubscribe after downloading it. The video is also divided in chapters, and you can even pick out a specific topic if you want to. Make yourself comfortable. Make a cup of coffee or tea if you like. Take a break from the multitasking. Philosophy of music in 100 plus 12 minutes. And go. These are the 8 areas I will discuss. What is the philosophy of music? History of the philosophy of music. Music, emotions and expressivity. Music and language. The ontology of musical works. Music education, towards a mature society. Phenomenology of music. Critical perspectives, music is not innocent. What is the philosophy of music and what is it not? Philosophy of music is a reflective discipline that discusses basic questions about the nature and value of music. It is mostly not based on empirical studies, even if it sometimes implements results from these studies. This has both pros and cons, and parts of the philosophy of music is sometimes called armchair philosophy, meaning philosophy you can do from your armchair without having to experience anything of the outside world or without having practical experience about a topic. It has a slightly negative ring to it. I believe this refers mainly to the parts of the philosophy of music that have the 18th and 19th century ideas about music as a fine art as their reference point, and do not discuss the context around music much further, nor how this music came to exist in the first place. Some other areas of philosophy of music raise questions about the institutionalized ideas of the field and may put more emphasis on the social and material conditions around musical practices. Philosophy of music is not the same discipline as aesthetics, but aesthetics of music is a subcategory of the discussions of the philosophy of music. Boring subcategory. Philosophical aesthetics is the study of beauty and taste. The word derives from the Greek word aesthetikos, which means of sense perception. Aesthetics came to exist as an independent discipline in the 18th century, introduced by Alexander Baumgarten, so it is not a very old discipline. We will discuss it in the second chapter. An important point about aesthetics is that the discussion turned the focus away from rational principles of music and its structure, and towards the sensuous experience of it. This followed from the development of society in other respects, as natural sciences and the Enlightenment became the new reference point of truth. Philosophy and its subjects, including the discussion of music, have followed other developments of society and also affected these developments. A few things to be mentioned about music as a type of art. The modern way of viewing music as one category of art, in a system of different art forms, is also not very old, but came to exist as art became autonomous as an institution. The philosopher Charles Bateau, who attempted to define general principles of the fine arts, music, poetry, painting, sculpture, and dance, regarded imitation of beautiful representations of nature as a defining factor for these art forms. Imitation has always been slightly tricky for music, especially instrumental music, since it seems not to be a representational art in the same way as, for example, poetry or painting. These comparisons of different art forms set off new types of discussions about how music could mean something in its own specific way and what music expresses. If you want to know more about the historical development of the different art forms and how the modern system of the arts came to exist, I recommend Paul Oskar Kristeller's long article, The Modern System of the Arts, a study in the history of aesthetics. It comes in 2 parts. It goes into depth about the diverse backgrounds and developments of art forms. It is important for me in this presentation to point out that the autonomous understanding is tied to a specific era, since a lot of the discussion is based on concepts and ideas that derive from this era. These ideas are, however, sometimes treated as universal, or at least a reference point in philosophy of music. To mention some other examples of subjects of philosophy of music: ontological questions of how a musical work can be defined, what is music and what is not music. Ontological explanations give general, non-empirical answers about how things around us exist. What is the meaning and value of music? Does music have its meaning in communicating something? Does it mean anything? Is it its own kind of language? And if so, is this language universal? These topics I discuss in the 3rd and 4th chapter. Another topic is music education. This subject has more ethical subtones to it, since it often touches on questions of how a good and democratic society might function, and how to raise individuals with good character and collaborative attitudes. This is not a discussion that is external to the music itself, but becomes part of the question of what music is and what it should be. Further, we will discuss phenomenology of music and hermeneutic studies. These approaches to music tend to focus on a more interpretative and critical discussion about how certain traditions have come to exist in the first place and how we use different terminology. Examples of other philosophical traditions that relate to the critical basis of these areas are pragmatism and critical theory. These I mention in several chapters along the way. Some of the motivations that lie behind different types of critical studies of music concern power of definition. Whose perspective has been present when a tradition has been defined and when a canon of musical works has been formed? How is it excluding? And how are these perspectives present in the power hierarchies of institutionalized musical practices today? This topic I will present in the final chapter. I have used many different sources in this presentation, but I want to mention especially the long article Philosophy of Music, published at Grav Music Online with 4 authors who are some of the central researchers of this field: Lydia Gör, Effie Sparshot, Andrew Bowie and Stephen Davies. I also refer to many of the thoughts from the book Johdatus musiikin filosofiaan with 7 Finnish authors. This one. But unless you read Finnish, it might not be your cup of tea. And I refer to all these books in this video, and many more. The history of the philosophy of music. This chapter is the longest one, but it will lay a lot of the groundwork for the following chapters. Early philosophical discussion of music derives from the Hellenistic era and from classical antiquity. The Greek word musike means the art of the muses. The muses were the goddesses of poetic inspiration. The word music did not only refer to what we associate with music today, but had several meanings. It referred to poetry, musical performance, and dance, and it even referred to some early forms of mathematics. The backgrounds of the different uses of this word were very diverse. When music was treated as a study, for example by the Pythagoreans, the study mostly referred to scales and tuning systems. In the Pythagorean view, the same ratios or proportions were found everywhere in the world, including in the stars and musical instruments, in the vibrations of a string, and in the intervals between notes. They were also thought to be found in the character of good men. In studying this cosmic order of relationships, music was important since ratios and intervals could actually be measured in music, not merely assumed, which is a point made by Sparshot and Gör. This attempt to establish a systematic and countable basis for music, a universal rule or order, has been part of the Western thinking ever since. It is most precise to refer to Pythagoreans or writings that have been assigned to Pythagoras rather than the person, like Pythagoras claimed this or Pythagoras claimed that. Since these thoughts developed over several centuries and there are no direct writings by the person Pythagoras, only writings that refer to him. Even further, thinking about history as a canon of individual researchers whose thoughts are labeled as building bricks of development towards a civilized society came to exist much later, even if we today often project this kind of view on the whole of Western history. Also, as Sparshot and Gör mention in the Groove article, we do not really have any documentation of what music was like in the classical antiquity, so the traces that are found about music have later been applied and interpreted very freely. Another central view from this period, which first derived from these thoughts of general principles that even concerned human character, was a social or ethical approach to music. National music was considered to reflect a national character, so different scales or modes were thought to reflect features about human character. Plato followed this development in his philosophy, and in his thinking music came to characterize a national ethos, a certain character of a moral nature. Plato did not discuss music in terms of mathematics or formal principles, but instead in the context of moral, the character of a person. Music also had an educative function. It was capable of moving us and shaping our moral compass. Plato suggested that the use of music should be regulated by the Republic. This view about the need for censorship seems very strange to us today. How could music as such be educative or harmful in some situations? Music itself is innocent, it is only music, or so it seems. Let us have a look at this dude. This is my own projection and perhaps my own bias. I do not know what they actually listen to through those cordless headphones, but my assumption is that this person is not aware of any moral danger in what he is listening to, nor does he think about how music morally develops his character to make him a good citizen for a democratic system. The way that this feels strange is perhaps also a symptom of our time, some of our ideas about music and freedom. Music has turned into a sensuous experience of the listener, and it seems to only mean whatever meaning the individual attaches to it. I am not advocating for censorship of music, of course, but pointing out certain developments in cultural attitudes. We will return to Hellenistic thinking in chapter 6, where we discuss music education and the philosophy of Aristotle. So, in the earliest discussions, some of the questions concerned the universal laws of music, and other questions concerned the social practices of it. However, not all thinking from this era attached great importance to music at all. Lucretius, for example, in the 1st century BCE, considered music to be only a source of innocent pleasure and nothing more. Music was, in a way, discovered by accident, with no further reason for it, and it served in relaxing and delightful ways. The pre-Middle Age and Middle Age era. In the era before and during the Middle Ages, music was separated from secular activities such as dance, and it was considered a servant of the divine. Music was central to the liturgy, but it was not necessarily considered to be central in its own terms. Saint Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, was a rhetorician and teacher who later converted to Christianity and the priesthood. He wrote more about other subjects, but also about music. Overall, he defined good music as something that is not the object of desire. Good music does not exceed the words it is meant to mediate. Augustine was even troubled by music's ability to speak to our desires, yet at the same time he realized that words had more power when accompanied by music. They inspired the worship of God. By these times, music was mostly either treated rationally as part of a cosmic order, as it was in the philosophical thinking of Boethius, or it was considered a servant of the liturgy. Thus, serious music was removed from the secular sphere and brought into an anti-hedonistic sphere. This anti-hedonism is my own way of putting it. This might seem strange to our time, as we want to be moved by music. But could this strangeness also reveal something that is typical for our time? Has music become a source of immediate pleasure and gratification? Has it become yet another drug for us? Could music today have a ritual or educative function that could help us focus on long-term moral goals? Could it train our focus? Any type of ascetic attitude is not much valued in Western culture today, unless it is actualized as a cool new trend that can be paraded on social media. The Middle Age philosophy was tightly connected to theology or even cosmology, or sometimes natural medicine. The thinkers of this time usually did not call themselves philosophers. One of the Middle Age figures, also considered a saint and mystic, was the abbess Hildegard von Bingen, often considered the first named composer of the Western tradition of music. Hildegard saw music as a means to capture the joy and beauty of paradise. Music was invented as a means to worship God. In her liturgical music, the melodic lines often leaped up and then flowed down with stepwise motion. These musical movements had a wide range, often more than an octave, and she had a melismatic style as opposed to using one syllable per note. These were all less conservative ways of composing music by the time. Hildegard was also a visionary, not in the modern sense of being a visionary, but she actually saw visions. Through medieval times, the field of music changed its character, especially when systems of mensural notation developed. Musical harmony gradually received a new type of emphasis. Elements that are written down, for example the parameters of pitch, duration and interval, often seem somehow stable or universal. They gained authority over other elements. Franco of Cologne in the mid-13th century was a central person to systematize musical notation. This had relevance for the further development of music and the thinking about music, since the composers could work more independently from behind their desk and develop musical systems. Throughout the medieval era and towards the Renaissance, music was also driven towards polyphony and more complex rhythms and harmonies. This was not a development from strict rules towards something freer. The rules of counterpoint and what intervals were allowed on emphasized notes were even more strict. Renaissance. In the early Renaissance, the musical focus came to concern the enjoyability of music to a greater degree. So it did not merely concern universal rules or the connection to religion or ritual context. Also, music came to be regarded, at least partly, as a practice with a certain history, a man-made practice. For example, John Case claimed that no myth or universal reason lay behind counterpoint or polyphony, but they were invented by human beings. The discussion of the Renaissance brought up the tension between polyphonic music and the melodic line. The melodic line had a closeness to the voice, the text and feeling or expression. This was also described as a tension between art and nature, where art represents the skilled use of polyphony and nature represents something inherent in the music, the melody and rhythm that follows naturally from language and articulation. This conflict was articulated in the quarrel between the music theorist and composer Giuseppe Zarlino and his student Vincenzo Galilei, who was a critique of Zarlino's theory. Zarlino attempted to find a middle ground between the ethos theory from the ancient times and the contemporary uses of music by moving the focus away from modes that reflect characters or certain feelings, as you remember from the Hellenistic era, and finding correlations between harmonies and certain feelings. The harmony and rhythm should reflect the words rather than the words or feelings being inherent in the music. Zarlino was particularly famous for developing triadic thinking and polyphony as opposed to the previous focus on intervals. The Art of Counterpoint by Zarlino. His student Galilei was part of the Florentine Camerata, a group of intellectuals, poets and musicians who wanted to revive ancient Greek music, the melodic line and the natural expression of the voice. Baroque. Rhetoric was a central study of academies in the Baroque period. While discussion of rhetoric derives from Hellenistic thought, with the division between logos, what is said, pathos, the way of awakening feelings in the listeners, and ethos, ways of gaining validity and reliability as a speaker. In music, this came to concern the presentational form. The connections of music and rhetoric seemed to be more direct in vocally expressed music than polyphonic music. But what about instrumental music? In the harmonic thinking of Zarlino, the meaning had to occur in other ways, with harmonies referring to these meanings or sentiments. The discussion of music and expression was central to the Baroque period. Rhetoric was used to try to make music mean something. It was also used as an attempt to formalize different types of figures and ornaments in music, but as Sparshot and Gör point out, these systems never found a stable form that lasted over time. When discussing musical meaning created through rhetoric, for example certain feelings that the music might symbolize, it is important to clarify that this did not mean the same as music creating feelings within the listener. The main focus was still not specifically on the listener as someone who would have an individual experience of music, nor was it on the composer as someone who would express themselves through music. The focus was still mainly on the music. Music was perhaps considered an organized way of formalizing passion. Formalized passion is a formulation from the chapter written by Sparshot and Gör. I am not sure if the expression was used by the time, but I really like this expression. Somehow it forms a contrast to the emphasis on the individual focus on emotional experience in our time. We are soon approaching the age of enlightenment, the era when reason and the sciences became the primary and most legitimate authority of society. Values that came to exist in this era were liberty, the separation of church and state, a constitutional government instead of a monarchic model, and moving towards a better world that uses reason as a compass. All these ideals belonged to the Enlightenment. In philosophy, during the time leading up to Enlightenment, questions were raised in new ways. Philosophy and the sciences have had historically a symbiotic relationship, and as modern sciences developed, some of the central questions of philosophy came to be what the primary source of information and knowledge ought to be. Do we receive knowledge primarily through our thinking, our rational mind, or through empirical investigations and the sensed world? These considerations had been part of philosophy from the beginning. Plato was the famous idealist or rationalist who considered our senses deceptive, and Aristotle has been associated with empiricism as a view. However, the new era gave rise to a new level of this discussion, which also had consequences for the discussion of art and the modern rise of aesthetics as a discipline. René Descartes, or René Descartes, from the time slightly before the Enlightenment, is perhaps the most central rationalist figure. He marked a new era in the approach to truth, especially through his methodological doubt in Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes attempts to find out whether there is something he can know for sure, with complete certainty, and he systematically doubts everything he can, including his senses and even his thoughts. The most well-known step in this process of methodological doubt is when he discovers that he must himself exist in one way or another, since someone is performing all this doubting. From there comes the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." From there he goes on step by step to prove that other things exist too, and that reliable knowledge does exist. Later critique of Descartes, presented for example by 20th century phenomenology, have pointed out that he did not actually find a more certain truth, but he defined truth in a new way as certainty. As truth discovered by the human being as a subject who places the universe in front of him as an object, as if he were not part of this universe himself. We will return to this topic. Descartes also contributed to musical thinking by advocating for objective criteria for aesthetic value rather than placing the importance in the effects or pleasures of music. This is a book by Descartes, The Passions of the Soul, though this doesn't really correlate with what I just said about Descartes. Read for yourself. The rationalist basis for harmony was taken further by Jean-Philippe Rameau, who attempted to create a system with a defined amount of chords and inversions. This is again another type of approach than the rhetorical approach. This is based on formal and architectural thinking, harmony being the most central element. This emphasis on harmony also created space for the importance of instrumental music. A quite other view was presented a bit later by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who emphasized the importance of the melodic line and expressive quality as the basis of music. Rousseau made the claim that language and music have a shared origin in passion, located in the voice. First only poetry was spoken, and reasoning came only later, he claims. And while abstract reasoning has developed language much further, language has lost some of the expressive qualities that still lie in the core of it. We will return to this subject in the chapter about music and language. Rousseau was not an empiricist as opposed to a rationalist, but rather he was a political and ethical thinker. He was also a critique of the Enlightenment and claimed that while it aimed at objective knowledge, it created new forms of tyranny. This is an essay by Rousseau on the origin of language. There are 2 essays in this book, and the other one is by Johann Gottfried Herder. During this time, as modern sciences developed, empiricism became relevant as a philosophical ideology. John Locke was one of the central figures promoting empiricism. He considered our concepts and thoughts having their basis in the sensed and experienced world. According to Locke, all knowledge comes from experience, and there are no innate ideas within us when we are born. In this sense, the human mind is first a blank slate. It was in this atmosphere of the development of the modern sciences and theories about knowledge that philosophical aesthetics came to exist too. The ritual functions of music were gradually faded out of the space of fine arts, and a new understanding of art followed. Different forms of art gradually developed into an autonomous institution, the modern systems and hierarchies of art. Arts were discussed in a new way under one umbrella. Aesthetics, established by Baumgarten, as mentioned before, came to concern beauty and taste, the sensed value of art, as opposed to seeking rational or mathematic principles behind harmonic structures. The focus also turned towards the experience and the experiencer of art. How then was music to be thought about in a world of enlightenment? In this world, language was considered central because of its semantic content, and sciences were central due to their verifiable truth. How would music maintain its relevance and not just become something nice and entertaining for our senses in this modern world of a new scientific worldview? From this space, a new discussion of the philosophy of music arose. One of the most central thinkers within aesthetics was Immanuel Kant, though mainly because of his theory of knowledge, not music specifically. In some ways he tried to save the freedom of the human subject, and he formed a synthesis between rationalism and empiricism. If the world, as defined in terms of the laws of natural sciences, only functions as physical processes in otherwise dead material, how can the freedom of the internal world of the human being be saved so that it is not just considered a deterministic result from causal processes? In Kant's theory of knowledge, we do not actually know anything about the world as it is, but we project a subjective reality upon this world and perceive it through our own laws. We give nature the law. The nature is there, but the way we perceive it is formed by our mental laws or categories. We see the nature as it appears to us, not as it is. Kant's thinking is also called a Copernican revolution. Nicolaus Copernicus' hypothesis in the 16th century was that the Earth moves around the Sun rather than the opposite. So, the Earth was not the center of the universe anymore. Kant described a similar Copernican revolution in the theory of knowledge. We do not begin our perception of reality from the reality as such, but our cognitive structures determine how the world presents to us and makes the experience possible. Categories are projected upon the world. Examples of such categories are ones that concern quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Further categories under quantity are named as unity, plurality, and totality. This becomes very abstract. Kant's philosophy is also called transcendental idealism. The mind transcends reality. Nonetheless, without the empirical world, thinking has no content, according to Kant. The external world is necessary for us to have an experience of anything at all. In the aesthetics of Kant, this means that the aesthetic value of the work of art is not to be found in the artwork itself, but the experience of it, impressions and delightful sensations. However, this does not mean that the judgment of art, good or bad art, is subjective or individualistic, but structures of cognition affect the experience. These are general, the criteria of taste is not individual. Kant's theory has later been criticized for being elitist and excluding. His attempt to place standards of aesthetic taste in human nature as a general rule, while the whole discussion was performed by a rather small group of white, educated, elitist Western men, has been considered problematic in the modern times. To present a final thought of Kant that has affected philosophy of music, he also developed a specific view about artistic genius. He was not the first one to talk about genius, but has been acknowledged for his view about it. Kant considers beautiful art as a result from the work of a genius. Kant defines genius as based on talent or natural inborn gift. All art incorporates certain general rules that make it beautiful. These rules are not found within art itself, but they are defined by the human subject. The genius has the capacity to create new rules about art, so not just following rules, but creating new rules. Genius must be an innate quality, because if it were a learned talent, it would be based on existing rules. An aspect that is worthwhile mentioning is that in Kant's time, originality became a new artistic quality. This does not mean that the new musical discoveries were not valued before, but explicitly focusing on originality or genius as valuable features of music seemed to mark a new era. Focusing on the individual behind the work of art, at least to this extent, also marks a new era. Gradually, artworks came to be seen as a result from a historical development of genius minds. This way of thinking about art is quite modern. In my humble opinion, this development also initiated something immature in the Western culture, even something infantile. This culture started to focus on the individual and the specialness of the individual, resulting in individuals competing for attention and admiration. I call this the infantile turn, since a toddler child is also the center of his or her universe and is actually allowed to be, until, hopefully, with a supportive upbringing, they individuate and discover boundaries between themselves and the world. They discover that they are not the center of the universe and that either all children are special or no one is special. There is no innate hierarchy of specialness. I have not heard anyone else use this term, the infantile turn, though. This is a topic for a whole other video, but it is important to mention regarding philosophy of music that the modern way of seeing the history of music as a canon of genius works is a result of a quite recent development. German idealism. Now, let us dive into German idealism and the Romantic era. This era continued with aesthetic discussion. This was really an era of philosophical system building. While philosophers have often built systems with general applicability, describing how this universe functions, German idealism was a culmination of the system building practice. It attempted to provide a complete picture of the world, keeping in mind some of the modern challenges that Kant's aesthetic thinking responded to. Schelling, too, attempted to find solutions to the opposition between causal rules or necessities of the natural world and the freedom of the human subject. In the philosophy of Schelling, art had the role of reconciling determinism with freedom, and the freedom of the subject is actually part of nature, too. Art expresses unity between the thinking subject and object. Several German idealists refer to this subject-object relationship and try to solve it in different ways. Schelling assumed that this relationship has an original union, so it is not dual. Schelling wrote about music that sounds, and he notes that it seems to arise in this particular battle between spirituality and reality, between subject and object. Schelling considers music the most temporal art form. Therefore, music is most tightly connected to the way the subject imposes unity onto the multiplicity of the natural world. This is a book by Schelling, The Philosophy of Art. To be honest, this philosophy does not make much sense to me whatsoever. Let's move on. Hegel is one of the most radical German idealists. He claims that only the rational is real. According to Hegel, reality as whole can be expressed as rational ideas. The ultimate reality to Hegel is the mind or idea. Hegel describes art as the sensuous appearing of the idea. He sees the development of art as a movement from classical art, which was based on sensuous beauty of the object, towards romantic art, which is the final phase of it. This final phase involves a realization that the highest truth is demonstrated in the ability of the mind to transcend the sensuous world. It needs to be mentioned that this type of hierarchy between ideas and the sensuous world is already present in the philosophy of Plato, who considers the ideas as being true and everlasting, and sensuous knowledge as being based on fleeting, unreliable impressions. Music for Hegel was not a representational art, since it did not refer to anything outside of itself. Thus, music is the art of the soul, and the art form that best expresses our inner life. In this sense, Hegel stood for an early type of musical formalism, music being self-contained. Hegel was in a way a system builder and also an anti-system builder. For Hegel, thinking was a constant state of change through a process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This means that ideas have the tendency to pass into their own negation, because the idea itself already contains its own contradiction. Hegel considered his own philosophy a culmination of this dialectic development. This is a book of Hegel, Taiteen filosofia, Philosophy of Art, an introduction to lectures in aesthetics. We do not have time for more German idealists, but if you are interested, you can also have a look at Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was one of the key developers of German idealism after Kant's theory, but who tried to avoid some of the dualism of Kant's approach. Arthur Schopenhauer, who considered music a representation of not ideas, but the will itself. The world as will and representation. And finally, Friedrich Schlegel, who thought that all different art forms involved understanding both the inner and the outer world, so there was not any difference between referential art, such as literature, and music. The method of writing a novel is the same, according to Schlegel, as that of composing instrumental music. Now, we have not talked so much about language and music in the Romantic era, but in many of the theories there were attempts to unify art and sciences in such a way that there would not be any final formal difference between language and music. The Romantic thinkers did not necessarily consider referential language more central or important than music, but music was regarded as valuable exactly because it expressed something that words could not express. On the other hand, words themselves could be considered to have musical and poetic qualities. Considering the value of music in ways that did not ground it in the sensuous or empirical reality, nor referential truth, made instrumental music respectable in new ways. It could be said that the Romantic thinking about music, representation, meaning and language laid grounds for discussion that is still in many ways present, as we will see in the following chapters. And finally, Hanslick. The music theorist Eduard Hanslick advanced the view of musical formalism, even if it was labeled as formalism only later. In this view, music is regarded as self-contained. This is very important to mention as part of the Romantic development in the discussion of music, and the writings of Hanslick have been significant for later times. Hanslick wanted to base his thinking on something else and more objective than the aesthetics of feelings. According to Hanslick, the beauty of art can't be separated from the specific techniques present in an art form. Thus, music and other art forms cannot be said to have the same basis for their beauty. In Hanslick's thinking, music itself is absolute, as opposed to representing something outside of itself. such as program music or opera, where music extends into other artistic expressions. Hanslick claims that when we investigate an artwork aesthetically, it is the artwork itself and not our experience of it that should be investigated. Hanslick's musical thinking is based on an understanding of art's autonomy. The value of art is in the art itself, not the experience. Furthermore, when we talk about music being self-contained or self-referential, this also finds its culmination in the thinking of Hanslick. Music is both its own content and its object. Musical material such as harmony, rhythm, and melody expresses musical ideas, not feelings and not referential ideas, but musical ideas, or harmonically moving forms. They are their own purpose and do not exist for an external purpose. As opposed to language, these musical ideas don't refer to anything. Music is non-referential, while language seems to have its truth in its referential value. Hanslick on the musically beautiful. Advocating this type of duality was not Hanslick's project alone, but it was symptomatic of the time. Alongside the development of the modern sciences, language lost its musicality and was considered true for its content or referential value. In Hanslick's theory, music became radically different from language, but that view of language was already being established in society. We will return to this subject in the chapter about music and language. These many different romantic thoughts have been criticized later due to certain Eurocentrism and elitism, their tendency to universalize, their tendency to discuss only music that is already part of high culture and the fine arts, and the problems of fitting these theories into a diverse world today with diverse musical practices. Still, these theories had an important function when they came to exist. When art became autonomous, it did not have a self-evident role in society anymore as part of a ritual, for example a religious ritual. To save music from becoming irrelevant, it needed to be explained in new ways. Its value needed to be explained. Perhaps we are still in a similar situation, trying to explain the value of music. How do we explain it to politicians, for example? Today, value is often measured from the perspective of being economically profitable, or being health-promoting, or at least being enjoyable and fun. Where do we place an autonomous understanding of music as not a tool for something external? Music that is not even delightful, but may have its value in other ways? The Romantic era initiated some attempts to explain the value of art in a way that suited the new world at the time. It had to make music autonomous and place it beyond this world, since this world seemed to be mostly based on means-ends reasoning. This tension reveals some of the value conflicts of society and seems to be much present even today. The following 4 chapters are shorter in length. In these chapters I have chosen several of the topics and philosophers of music from the book Johdatus musiikin filosofiaan, and especially the chapters written by Elina Pakkaleen, Erkki Huovinen, Marja Heimonen and Heidi Westerlund. Further, I have used a lot of other sources too. Music, emotions and expressivity. Let us lean back in our armchair for a moment and forget about all the complex and diverse backgrounds of musical discussion. Let us now consider music, emotions and expressivity from a simple and honest place, how music has affected us or how it seems to reach us by its expressivity. Maybe you love listening to certain types of music. Maybe you are a music collector. Maybe you remember the best tracks of the albums that you have on your CDs or vinyl records, and even specific moments of those songs that you feel very deeply. You might be able to hear what happens in the music at those moments, yet you cannot explain why the music has a certain effect. Music itself is not a person. How can music then express something? Can we understand music as a means of human beings expressing themselves? Or can music itself have some qualities that are inherently expressive? Does a minor key always sound melancholic? Does fast music sound energetic? Overall, theories about music and expressivity, or music and emotions, seem to share one aspect. We are looking for something human-like in music, or perhaps lifelike. It is advantageous to explore this relationship as a general one, as opposed to a completely private experience. In this way, we do not end up with statements such as, "it is all subjective," which makes further philosophical discussion impossible. Further, discussion that concerns expressivity is often looking for a specific value inherent in music, or general value in what it expresses. If music were simply a means for the individual to express themselves, the music itself would be something external and even unnecessary. Another medium could be chosen for the exact same purpose. Or, if the meaning of music were simply about the emotions that are aroused in the listener, separate from the music itself, then we could attach the same value to medicine, alcohol, or other drugs, or whatever creates that effect in us. But the experience seems to concern music, not simply the effects of it. These words, expressivity, emotion, and feeling, are often used in many different ways, sometimes synonymously, and other times they mean different things. In this presentation, it suffices to say that when we talk about emotions, it also includes intentionality of the listening experience. It could also involve cognitive elements. Now let's have a look at what some of the contemporary philosophers of music say about this topic. I will present a few arguments about this quite quickly, mainly to give an idea about what topics are discussed and to mention relevant names of philosophers for further reading. Let us first discuss the directly emotional, almost causal effect of music. Derek Matravers is an example of a philosopher who considers musical expression to affect our feelings directly, causally. You know what a causal connection is. Without any intentionality of the listener being necessary. He claims that we experience the expressions of music in a similar way as the emotions of another human being. When someone in the room is sad, we are often affected by this state ourselves. So, the movements of music cause similar movements in the listener. This approach emphasizes that we are affected by music as opposed to our emotions being about music. There is a difference between being affected by something and, for example, liking certain types of music. You don't need to like something to be affected by it. Gerald Levinson, on the other hand, makes the claim that music is not just passively received. Negative emotions in music can be experienced in a positive way, since we are not personally touched by a negative event. So, we have agency in the role of being a listener. According to Levinson, music even has a relation to our thoughts in a similar way as language. This is a book by Levinson, The Pleasures of Aesthetics. Further critique of the direct causal effects is presented by Elina Packalen, who points out that our knowledge about music affects our experience of it. We do not experience music in a vacuum. Our cultural background and what we know and understand about music affects our experience about it. Now let us discuss music and representation of emotions. Not causal effect, but representation. Jennifer Robinson is one of the philosophers who have supported the significance of emotional content of art. She claims that art does not only create emotional responses in us, but many artworks need to be emotionally experienced to be understood at all. So, the artworks themselves require comprehension of an emotion. The feelings are not just passive products of observing art. This is a book by Jennifer Robinson. Music and Meaning. A further view I want to mention is that of Peter Kivi, who claims that musical expression does not need to be experienced by the listener themselves for the music to be perceived correctly. Music itself can be happy or hesitating. One can observe the music but at the same time have an opposite feeling. In this sense, music does not cause emotions, but emotions can be observed in music. Kivi has been considered an extended formalist in his view, in the sense that he locates the value of music in music itself. However, as opposed to Hanslick, he claims that music can express emotions, or garden variety emotions, general emotions such as sadness, anger or fear, even if we are not directly moved by them as the listener. This is a book by Kivi. Sound Sentiment, an essay on the musical emotions. It is, however, difficult to explain such general types of emotions in an objective way. There could be individual and cultural differences about how music is comprehended. On the other hand, Kivi's theory does not exclude the possibility that certain expressivity is cultural. Susanne Langer made the claim in the first half of the 20th century that music cannot be perceived as separate from its expression, and that music expresses objective forms of emotions that cannot be described directly in language. So these are not garden variety emotions, not even anything that has direct correlations in words. This is different from theories that claim that music expresses feelings or gets the listener to experience certain feelings. The forms of emotions are embedded in the music. A musical composition is an artistic symbol or an expressive form. While language makes sense through its logical or intellectual content, music makes sense through its emotional content, symbolically. Music is a symbol that enables a conception, yet the conception is not a word. Sounds very complicated, but at the same time this theory avoids some of the problems of some other theories. Overall, in my perspective, when music is discussed in this way as inherently consisting of emotions, or symbols of emotions, feelings, or expressions, it's a bit alienating. I will say a bit more about it, but first a little bit about the context. This type of discussion, which is often part of Anglo-American philosophy or analytical philosophy, does have some advantages. For example, the fact that these are not system-building theories. They are often less speculative. The writers are also, in a way, honest about their participation in a joint discussion. They actively refer to others in the same field, and they often write in a way that is suggestive rather than manifesting. They sometimes change their view over the years, so it is really about developing the thinking in a field as researchers. However, these views often refer to examples based on a harmonic understanding of music, which is often based on a tonal system. There are problems about choosing this as a reference point. The many changes that have happened within compositional practice have been responses to changes in society in different ways. This music is not universal. Some of the 20th century atonal music attempted to distance itself from the romantic languages of music, to neutralize the, so to say, emotional aspects, and even to find scientific neutrality, because those romantic sounds communicated national romanticism. This was considered problematic in the post-war era. My critique is that when the tonal harmonic system is picked as a reference point, it is not acknowledged that music carries all these historical meanings that are contextual. My further critique is that ethical perspectives on music seem to be irrelevant in this discussion. Music seems to simply communicate feelings or arouse feelings in us, and we keep discussing the details of it. Overall, music seems to be considered a source of pleasure. As discussed, Plato considered music dangerous because it could penetrate our souls in a particular way. Saint Augustine saw musical passion as secondary and problematic, something that should be a medium in the worshipping of God. This dude is likely not thinking about ethical aspects, but he is raised in a culture where value has become relative and music has become enjoyable. It has become a drug. Digital distribution of music has perhaps accelerated this process of individualized perception, since it is up to the individual to figure out their likes and dislikes and download the likable music to their playlist. We could even ask further whether there is actually a cultural void that music is expected to fill today when it is turned into such an enjoyable thing. Maybe we have wanted to place music in a beautiful world beyond this world because this world has lost its depth, or it has lost some of its magic. This sounds a bit romantic, but I don't mean it in a romantic way. In the discussion of music and emotions, music seems to some extent de-dangerized. This is not an actual English word, but it is my construction, translated from the Norwegian word å ufarliggjøre. I think it exists in German too, and that maybe Adorno has used that word. This is not to say that we should go back in time, but looking back at different cultural perspectives helps us see that the way we do things today is not the only possibility. Music and language. The attempts to find analogies between music and language have their origin in a few things. We want to understand why music is meaningful to us. The attempts are also a result of the need to advocate for the relevance of music. As already discussed, the relationship between music and language changed in the time following from the Enlightenment, and the modern approach to language and knowledge developed. Sometimes it resulted in music being mystified and considered to transcend this causal or physical reality. Other times it resulted in the attempt to find musical qualities in language itself and thus overcome the gap. But it also led in a direction where music was considered its own kind of language with inner structure or syntax, but without semantics in the sense that language seems to refer to objects or states of affairs. Let us have a look at some of the discussions about music and language closer to the contemporary times. Jean-Jacques Nattier is a central developer of thinking around music and semiotics, or music and meaning. He represents a view that meanings arise from a certain cultural context and that you cannot determine the meaning of one element or one sign in isolation from other elements. This is also called a structuralist view of both language and art. This view conflicts with some historical understandings of music. The many attempts to base music on universal rules or mathematics, but also the institutionalized practices that are sometimes treated as facts. Nattier also views musical signs, the musical elements, as infinite in the sense that there are infinite possibilities. According to Nattier, this makes music an unstable communicator of symbols or meanings. Musical meaning rises from a whole web of meanings present in music, and even if the composer would have certain architectural intentions behind the work, the receiver could understand it differently. Though Nattier does not say that language is completely reliable either. There remains some type of gap in communication, but there still seems to be a difference. This is a book by Nattier, Music and Discourse, Towards a Semiology of Music. I do not agree that there is a great difference between music and language in this specific sense, that there would be a great gap in communication between the composer and the experiencer of music in the sense that Nattier proposes. Sitting alone, composing a musical score is actually a very social activity where you engage with a complex web of shared existing meanings. You stand in dialogue with notational practices, historical and contemporary musics, instrumental traditions, the traditions of musicianship, and even the concert hall or space where the world premiere is planned. All these relationships are present in composition, and you make active choices with regards to these elements. They are often part of the musical content too. This I have written about in the article Musical Compositions and Fractures, Leaving Traces in Material, Technique and Thought. In case you are interested, I will share a link to it down below. Perhaps the idea about the composer's work that Nattier has in mind is a slightly more romantic one. If we assume that the composer seeks to express themselves or create harmonies in, more or less, a self-contained way, then there might be a bigger gap between their intention and the perception of the music. Both composing and listening happen in a space of shared cultural reference points. These reference points could, of course, be partly different for a singular listener than the composer. Roger Scruton, famous for his conservative perspectives about music, claims that the analogy between music and language does not make sense as long as we cannot prove musical words to have meanings, or musical words. Music may be able to imitate elements in the external world, such as the singing of birds, but it does not have semantic meaning in the same way as language. Scruton emphasizes the expressive capacities of music. Listeners experience an expression of emotions. For Scruton, then, music consists in the expression of emotions. This is a book by Scruton, Music as an Art. Let us think about the aspect of meaning for a moment. Scruton uses the imitation of natural elements as an example of music possibly referring to something outside of itself, and then claims that this is not central to the experience of music. But there are completely other ways that music could mean something too, not just imitating sounds in the external world. In many ways, music cannot not mean anything or refer to anything. The sound of a flute refers to a tradition where the flute has been present as an instrument, a tradition of flute playing. Certain instrumental techniques refer to certain cultures or historical phases. A wide vocal vibrato could sound expressive or romantic. The sound of a church organ could send the signal religion, and these are only a few examples. Music almost cannot get rid of these meanings. As Susanna Välimäki points out, music is condemned to meaning. Music cannot escape meaning something. Here she writes about the fact that music is condemned to meaning, feminine endings, music, gender, and sexuality. Several composers themselves have described compositional practice as interpreting and battling these meanings. For example, Helmut Lachenmann. It is perhaps mostly in classical and romantic music, in tonal, harmonic progressions, that the emotional qualities that Scruton describes rise to the surface. The music is placed in an era or style by the listener, also by one who does not know the specifics about music history. The music might carry the association of national romanticism. Or, if we listen to a symphonic work, we might hear, "This is serious music." This way of acknowledging the connotations that are necessarily present is typical of critical theory, and this point is also made by Theodor Adorno, who we will return to. Peter Kivy and Derek Cook can be mentioned as philosophers who see music as a language, and more specifically, a language of emotions. But there are many others too. Kivy suggests that music is language-like, in the sense that it has something semantic-like about it. Music refers to something meaningful, otherwise it would be nonsense, and obviously it is not nonsense. It communicates something similar to linguistic meaning through its expressivity. According to Kivy, this expressivity contains emotive elements. We have discussed the garden variety theory of feelings in the former chapter. According to Kivy, human beings have the tendency to listen to music as passionate speech. Derek Cook, too, claims that music is the language of emotions and that its harmonies are capable of communicating emotions, though he does not really manage to suggest a system of how the different elements of certain emotional functions are put together. This is a book by Cook, The Language of Music. There are many others who have made specific arguments about music being or not being its own kind of language, and often this concerns a language of emotions. If you are interested, you could read, for example, Stephen Davies, Anne Clark, or Susanne Langer on this matter. In many of these theories about music and language, the reference point is taken from linguistics, not music. Then, attempts are made to find something similar about music and language. Perhaps the comparison that begins from linguistics has failed with its premises. The typical assumption about language in this comparison is that language does have some kind of unambiguous semantic content, or that it does refer to objects in the external world. So, there is often implicitly an assumption that meaning is formed in these ways, through reference. This is a critical point that, for example, philosopher Andrew Bowie makes about the ways in which philosophy of music often discusses this relationship. Music, Philosophy and Modernity by Andrew Bowie. But not all philosophical theories about language have these bases. We have already shortly discussed Rousseau's view that music and language have a shared origin in passion, in articulation and intonation. This type of theory has its productive value in acknowledging the musical qualities of language itself, and that the sounds of the words themselves are not random or irrelevant to the meaning. However, any theory that makes claims about the origins of language might end up as speculative, since it is not necessarily possible to discuss the topic objectively. We are already inside language when we discuss it. Acknowledging this impossibility is called immanence. We can't objectively say anything about language that can be verified or falsified from an external position. We are inside language. This is the thinking of Ludwig Wittgenstein in his early philosophy described in Tractatus. We can say internally everything about language. We can analyze it internally, but we cannot say what it has to have in common with the external world to represent it. So, in a way, early Wittgenstein still stands for a referential theory of language. Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a Finnish version, still with the same title. Wittgenstein's later philosophy is more often referred to in artistic or musical context. Wittgenstein changed some of his views about language. One of his later claims is that language must always receive its meaning from a shared practice. Wittgenstein is famous for using the expression language games, referring to the fact that language is interwoven in actions. Words and expressions have their meaning as part of a game with certain rules. For example, the utterance, "a glass of wine," could be an answer to a question, or it could be an order made to a waiter. Later, Wittgenstein still finds himself with an immanent understanding of language, but this language is learned within a shared world. This is often called intersubjectivity. You cannot learn the rules of language games by them being explained, but only by being part of this practice yourself. Some of you may have experienced how much quicker you learn a new language by just moving to a new place. The learning process is quite different from learning a language from a book, word by word. The culture is part of the language. Even a certain type of humor or mentality is part of it. Overall, this theory of language games makes Wittgenstein's late philosophy applicable to many other fields, including artistic practice. Language games can be discussed in parallel with what is called tacit knowledge in arts. Certain knowledge that cannot be explained in words. It is embedded in ways of doing things, in a practice. From this point of view, comparing music with language seems far less alienating, since they can both be described as practices or language games, or music games. I have this one book by late Wittgenstein in Finnish, Varmuudesta, on certainty. It is more about epistemology. I want to mention two other philosophers who have discussed language in a way that is based on performative and dramaturgical aspects. J.L. Austin and Dan Ide, coming from very different philosophical backgrounds. J.L. Austin, not Jane Austen, but the British philosopher John Longshore Austin, is famous for his idea about speech acts. Austin divides the speech act in three components. The locutionary act, which refers to the meaning of the specific words themselves that are used. The illocutionary act, meaning what the speaker intends to do with the speech act. And finally, the perlocutionary act, meaning what the listener interprets from the words. I consider this system of Austin an attempt to systematize some of the complex ways language receives its meaning as an act, in a way that creates space for performativity. Austin is not often referred to in philosophy of music, but should be mentioned in discussion of language as performative practice. This is a book by Austin, Näin tehdään sanoilla, which means how to do things with words. Phenomenologist Dan Ide is important for the topic of the musical and dramaturgical qualities of language. We have a chapter about phenomenology coming up. Now it suffices to say that Ide emphasizes the dramaturgical aspect of language and locates the core of language in the breathing, the utterance, the body, and the expression. However, this core hides itself. We pay attention to language as the already abstracted content. This will become clearer in the upcoming chapter. This is a book by Ide, Listening and Voice, Phenomenologies of Sound. It can be warmly recommended. Adorno's critical theory presents perspectives that are important to many of the areas of the philosophy of music, including music and language. Regarding language, his approach is quite different from any of the mentioned theories. In Adorno's view, language itself is contaminated in the modern times as a result of a gradual development, especially as a result of the Enlightenment. where the human subject has become more and more controlling and objectifying of the surrounding world, the nature, or the other. Language has lost its actual connection with the world, and the relationship between the subject and object, has become one where the subject dominates the object. In language, this means that the human being projects their existing ideas upon the world, and in the end they consider real only what suits their already existing expectations. Reasoning has become a circular process. This relationship with nature is, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, a mythical fear that has become extreme. There should not be anything uncertain. The world is forced to identity with existing concepts. This one is a Danish translation, Upplysningens dialektik. This description of modern alienation is central to understanding what Adorno writes about music, since it is tightly linked to his pessimism about the modern situation. This is aesthetic theory, translated into Norwegian by Arild Linneberg. It is a great translation. Linneberg has also written books about Adorno, if you read a Scandinavian language. I have much more literature by and about Adorno, but this subject is a bit too massive to get further into. But I want to use this opportunity to emphasize his critical backgrounds in the critique of the Enlightenment, since his writings about music are too often read and quoted without this context. So many recent researchers have said something about the relationship between music and language. I want to make a few final recommendations. I want to mention philosopher Vibeke Tellman, who wrote the thesis Musicalitet i teorien, meaning the music of the theory or musicality of theory. It's written very well, and its list of literature is massive. This one. I have used it almost as a dictionary myself. In my own research, I have built further on her idea that the relationship between music and language was not problematic in the same way before the Romantic era, and especially before Hanslick and musical formalism. I have discussed this topic myself in my article Composition of Vocal Music Against Primacy of Content, where I study how this modern split or duality is present in compositional work. I describe composition of vocal music as a space where language and meaning is in the making, and which thus has access to look at this relationship critically. You can find a link to the article down below. And finally, after Debussy, Music, Language and the Margins of Philosophy. This is a book by Julian Johnson, published in 2020. Johnson also has backgrounds both in musicology and composition. The ontology of musical works. This area of the philosophy of music explores the ways in which the musical work exists. Is the musical work at its core the musical instruction presented in a score, or is it the collection of the performances of the work? Or is the musical work simply a culturally created word that collects all the appearances of what we call musical works, without any more essential meaning? An implicit point of departure in many of the attempts to answer this question is that music is, in one way or another, sound organized in time, that the work has a clear beginning and end, that the work is an object for the listening experience. The certain components of the Western tradition, the work, composer, performer, the listening space of a concert hall, have already been determined when we discussed the ontology of the musical work. But for a moment, let us not make things too complicated. Let us stick to our armchair. In the book Johdatus musiikin filosofiaan, Elina Packalen divides the different areas of the ontological discussion into 4 different categories. The score model. According to this model, the central features of the musical work are defined by the musical score. The nominalist model. According to this view, the musical work is a collection of the different performances of it. The realistic model claims that a musical work is found within the abstract sound structure itself that is to some extent defined in the score, but the physical score is not the musical work itself. The idealistic model regards the musical work as a structure in the mind of the composer, which is mediated, at least with some precision, within a score. Let us discuss these models. One advantage of the score model is that it makes it possible to distinguish between the work itself and the performances of the work. However, performances can be quite different and a lot of elements could be improvised. Also, not all works are based on musical scores, nor even written down. A further problem is that if we accept this view, then the musical work would cease to exist if all the scores of it were destroyed. It seems more intuitive to think that the work would still exist, for example in our memory, or through reviews that have been written about it, or simply through the fact that it was once composed and performed. Nelson Goodman considers the score a central factor for identifying the identity of a musical work, but the score does not define the work itself. The work is, actually, the collection of performances that equal the score, or that can be identified by the score. So, Goodman is a nominalist, the second of the four models. However, as Packalen also notes, there could be great difficulties defining what principle collects the performances under one defined work, especially with works before the Romantic era. In the 18th century, there was usually much more improvisation involved. Some parts of scores have been written more likely as suggestions than as a definitive part of the composition. The third model, which is called realistic, is perhaps the least intuitive one. This follows a Platonic idea of the world of ideas where, for example, mathematic facts exist in a universal way, regardless of context. Some rules of sciences, for example, are considered as existing regardless of the individuals who discover them, and regardless of what culture the discoverers live in. In a similar way, the musical work is a projection or presentation of possible states of affairs. Philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff supports this kind of view. This is a book by Wolterstorff, Works and Worlds of Art. This type of thinking is also based on what is called types and tokens in philosophy. Types meaning general types of things, for example a cat as an idea, tokens being concrete instances, particulars of it. The musical work, too, is a norm type, and the performances are tokens, concrete instances of it. At least it goes somewhere in this direction. I am sure you will discover much more if you read Wolterstorff by yourself. However, this sounds a bit detached from any context. Music is not merely a sound structure that consists of pitches and durations discovered by a composer, but it responds to certain developments going on in society during a certain time. Further, compositional work can be very messy, social and handcrafty. The first performance or workshop meeting could be more like an experiment. The music matures every time it is performed, the notation matures, and the composer might make small musical changes along the way when hearing how the music turned out. In my opinion, the world premiere should not even be the performance that is reviewed, but it should be more like, okay, fine, let's give this music a chance. Making these actual processes of composition more visible, including the diverse methods of composing, would contribute to bringing the discipline down from the world of ideas. The world of musical ideas as discoveries sounds idealizing. However, Wolterstorff does acknowledge the social reality around the work, and he writes a wonderful book chapter about it, The Work of Making a Work of Music. He even makes ironic comments about how musical creation has been mythologized. I have not completely understood how these different views can coexist in Wolterstorff's philosophy, but I warmly recommend that book chapter. It is found in this book. According to the fourth model, the idealistic one, the musical work is what is happening in the mind of a composer. So, not the score, not the performance, not the experience of the music, but the mind of the composer. R.G. Collingwood is one of the representatives of the idealistic model. He claims that the work is located inside the mind of the composer. It also has its physical expression in the concrete world as the score and as the performed music. From the performance, the listener can reconstruct the original idea, the composition. In a way, the sound that the audience hears is not the music itself. Collingwood, The Principles of Art. This mind of the composer approach seems strange. since composition as a practice is so often trying and failing, and as described, it can be a very social activity, also when you are doing it alone by a score. You are not merely thinking about musical ideas and then writing them down, but you get your hands dirty. You try out different materials together and sometimes they fall into place. Through the experimentation, you may figure out new possibilities that you never would have thought of. However, Collingwood's claim is more complex than it might first appear. He does acknowledge that the ideas come from sensations and are situational, not something free that the artist simply discovers in their mind. Collingwood acknowledges that the artist finds the solutions by engaging with the handcraft. Overall, the discussion of musical works and how music exists could be more nuanced and complex if it included other musics than the European high culture from the past 300 years. What is often chosen as a reference point involves a specific understanding of a musical work as an object, which can be experienced and studied by the human subject. As philosopher Lydia Gör points out in the Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, it was not before around the year 1800 that the modern understanding of a musical work, the composer, the score, and the listener found their modern institutionalized forms. Music has in many ways been a practice with different forms of participation, not an object upon which the individual places aesthetic judgment. This is the book by Gör, The Imaginary Museum of Musical Works. In folk music, for example, the dancing activity, people meeting in a space, is often part of the musical practice and also formative for the music. Or Baroque music, which is far more improvised. Or early opera, often performed in noisy spaces where people spoke, played chess, and did a lot of other activities. The music had to compete for the attention of the audience, as Abbate and Parker describe it. It was in these circumstances that the extravagant Venice opera with virtuous song flourished. Thus, the context affected the musical content. It was not until the time of Wagner in the 19th century that the opera house was turned into a quiet space where one was expected to simply listen and be absorbed by the music. In this book, A History of Opera, Abbate and Parker write about this development. Further, the musical work as a reference point does not respond to music as part of a religious ritual where singing resonates within the walls of a church or cathedral as a space. Historically, it was not always so important whose composition it was. The same cantus firmus, a fixed melody, was used over and over again in different works or masses. All these contexts affect the music itself too. It is not the case that the music is first composed from the imagination of the composer and only then placed in a context. It is time to rise a bit from our armchair and discuss the actuality or relevance of the ontology of musical works. In what situations could this type of discussion have actuality? One possible context is the topic of copyright issues. The ownership of a musical work, development of copyright membership services, and the laws of copyright. Who made the work? It could be many persons. Is the musical score the reference point of a work? What about graphic scores or conceptual works that are simply written down as a text? Also, there are so many different types of music creators today. There is musician-based composition. Composers and musicians have different forms of collaborations. There is popular music and electronic music. Interdisciplinary art projects are more and more common too. Plenty of changes have happened only through the past decade. Defining different categories of original works and the royalties related to these categories is one possible context where it could be beneficial to know some of these philosophical concepts. Copyright issues are not only important due to the distribution of royalties, but this also concerns ownership. Those who work in less commercial ways still have ownership of their expressions, ideas, lyrics, etc. No one can steal their work away and use it for their own purposes. This is not my area of expertise, but I assume that the subject also relates to freedom of speech and perhaps protection from censorship. Due to certain copyright laws, no one can censor a part of your artwork without your consent. This is not to say that philosophers should be making decisions about copyright laws. I would not trust philosophers with this kind of engagement, but some of these concepts could perhaps be useful. Music education. Marja Heinonen and Heidi Westerlund have written a great chapter about music education as part of philosophy of music. The reason I really want to include this as a topic is that it serves to bring philosophy of music down from the world of quietly contemplating genius minds to living people of all ages, both children and professionals, learning and being part of society. It also serves to view music a bit differently than the work-centered view that is strongly present in the field of art music. Philosophy of music education has reference points in early philosophy, the Aristotelian understanding of music education as part of the development of the character of the individual. For Aristotle, the polis, the city-state, was responsible for educating the individuals and creating conditions for them to grow up and become good citizens. This also ties together with the Aristotelian understanding of happiness, eudaimonia, as a balanced living where the potential and goodness of the individual is actualized. Aristotle also describes the ideal context for musical learning and upbringing, and what kind of considerations and practical wisdom it demands from the educator. Music education concerns raising responsible, balanced, socially capable individuals who are also independent and have a free will. These views have been interpreted and taken further by some of the more recent philosophers, for example in the tradition of philosophical pragmatism. I would like to mention John Dewey, who Heinonen and Westerlund also refer to, and his books Democracy and Education, this one, and Art as Experience. Another philosopher relevant to this context is Richard Schusterman, who finds himself somewhere between critical theory and philosophical pragmatism, though for him pragmatism wins. Schusterman, Pragmatist Aesthetics. In this approach, society or community is not simply considered something that surrounds the individual. The individual does not encounter music singularly. Rather, the experience of the individual is partly constituted by the community. In Dewey's approach, one learns by doing, and the process of upbringing is not only a tool to reach a goal, for example, to create excellent musicians, but it's also a goal in itself. The school or other community is a small society where the individual, the child, is present here and now. The individual learns to function as part of this society, playing music together with other children. Some ideas about excellence in music are also critiqued in this area of philosophy of music. From this perspective, excellence is not the pure and only goal of music. The goal is to make all the children participate and collaborate well, and from this usually results excellent music too. This is an important point that challenges some of the unarticulated expectations of Western art music practice. For example, the music industry is based on star musicianship. The musician or composer is valued for their virtuosity, and when they succeed, they are considered a star, almost like a sports star. Music becomes a sport where you make gains towards success, as opposed to being a reflective and collaborative space. If you are listening and thinking, boring, this concerns kids and music education, while you want to stand on the stage and perform your stuff, or compose excellent music and be recognized for it, then perhaps you are part of the problem. You may find fruitful thoughts that are relevant to this issue also in the writings of philosopher Hannah Arendt, even though she writes about society and political philosophy, not about music education. Arendt too has the city-state as a reference point when she describes a democratic society. For Arendt, certain plurality is necessary for thought to develop at all. Individuals meet each other and share their thoughts from different points of view, from different standpoints in society. This is the space where thinking happens. Normativity or normality, thoughts following defined patterns, expectations or norms, is even dangerous. Thinking together is not only a democratic way of meeting, but plurality of thought is necessary for thinking itself to develop. This is one book by Arendt where she discusses the connection between normality and evil, Eichmann in Jerusalem, but her main work is Vita Activa. If we think about making music together in the Deweyan sense as practicing a democratic way of collaborating, and further that the children even form their own society when doing this, my thinking is that there is no reason to limit this to children. A lot of adults may have missed this type of education of inclusion, mature ways of acknowledging the existence of another person, their other perspective, their otherness and autonomy. Would it be possible to apply this to adults too? Could we make, for example, the world's leading politicians collaborate and make a concert together for their families and a local audience? Let's make a spring concert together. A further important aspect about the Aristotelian perspective is that it is not based on idealizing the individual person and their talent, but the goal of the individual and the community, the city-state, are considered to be aligned. Since Aristotle writes about actualization of potential and happiness, this could easily be misunderstood by modern psychology or business logic as what we consider self-realization in the modern sense. But this concept is far less individualistic in the Aristotelian thinking. Aristotle divides happiness into lower and higher categories, where the lower ones seem to be related to some of the self-realization in the modern sense. The lowest level refers to happiness from the material, sensed reality, an immediate passing joy. The second lowest level concerns the ego, the comparison with others, being better or striving to win. The third level, moving higher up in the hierarchy of happiness, concerns happiness from helping others, doing good deeds and making the world a better place. The highest level of happiness relates to an ethical or spiritual awareness, connecting with something universal. True happiness has a more permanent character than passing joy and is linked to a balanced living as part of society. This way of seeking productive thought from the classical antiquity does not come from a place of nostalgia, nor from the wish to idealize this culture. Not everyone was even considered part of society with personal agency at the time, but the productive outcome is to see that the way we are practicing music today, or the ethos of music today, is not a natural human condition, but it is also cultural. Things could be otherwise. This topic also helps create political arguments for the importance of funding music education. There could otherwise be misunderstandings based on romantic ideas about music. Perhaps that music does not have anything to do with our social world, that it is simply a space for self-expression or self-realization, a product on top of the hierarchy of needs. But music education is not there merely to teach us play an instrument, nor is it there for us to simply have fun together with music. It is connected to raising good human beings, too, who collaborate and function in a democratically organized way. Phenomenology of music. This is usually not defined as its own separate field, but I wanted to include this as a topic, since phenomenological concepts are often applied from philosophy to other disciplines, including music. Sometimes it is used as a tool or methodological approach in artistic research projects or practice-based research as well. In music it appears to be applied, for example, in different types of sonic art, acousmatic music, or interdisciplinary art forms such as film. If you want to apply concepts from phenomenology, you will benefit from knowing what questions it attempts to answer. Phenomenology is the philosophy of experience, or study of lived experience. It is usually not defined as a theory, but a methodological approach or research area. To understand its background, let us return to the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who greatly affected phenomenology. As already discussed, he claimed that there is a difference between the actual object and the way the object appears to us, the phenomenon. The way the object is perceived is affected by the perceiving subject, for example, their way of locating things in time and space. Phenomenology does not necessarily create a theory about empiricism or rationalism, nor about the way the world exists, but it seeks to study how a lived experience presents itself. It focuses on not the actual object, but our perception and experience about the object. Phenomenology as a discipline was initiated by Edmund Husserl in his logical investigations. For him, it is a method that divorces Western rationalism that has been present since Plato. A central critique of rationalism is that it begins thinking from the thinker's thoughts about the world, as if the thinker themselves were not part of this world. Husserl puts emphasis on the lived experience. He combines a scientific or psychological approach with logic. We will not dive deeper into Husserl, but have a short look at some of the other central phenomenologists of the 20th century. Martin Heidegger's phenomenology has emphasized the way we are always already situated in the world. We find ourselves in the world doing things, talking, using tools, being together with other people. Human beings are not first isolated individuals who then choose to establish a relationship with the world, but they always already find themselves in this world and in this relationship. Instead of using the word human or human subject, Heidegger uses the German word Dasein. It is sometimes translated to existence, but it is not a very precise translation. Da refers to there and Sein refers to being, but at the same time it does not point at a location in space, but actually away from that location, towards everything that Dasein already finds themselves in a relationship to. You are always already in the world. You find yourself thinking, doing, talking, being occupied with things, and this is a precondition for any reflection at all. You are interwoven in all the networks of meanings. Your thinking begins from the middle of the world. This is also a response to meditations of René Descartes, and more specifically, the Cartesian ego. Heidegger, as many other more recent philosophers, have criticized the starting point of the reflections of Descartes by saying that one can't isolate oneself from the world to perform a methodological doubt about it. One is necessarily always already part of this world. Even the language one uses to think about this world at all, it all has its basis in this world. In his early philosophy, in the work Sein und Zeit, Heidegger creates certain concepts to emphasize situatedness, or in der Weltsein, referring to the way we are always already in the world. Zuhandensein refers to the way in which the world is at hand, meaning the world is not an object, but we perceive objects as interwoven with our intentions and activities. Heidegger creates a lot of new words, or gives words new meanings that reveal something about the existential structure of Dasein. Heidegger in Finnish, oleminen ja aika, Sein und Zeit. But German translates much better into Norwegian, världen och tid. In his later philosophy, Heidegger wrote The Origin of the Work of Art. Here he leaves some of the ontology of Sein und Zeit behind, but I think the phenomenological aspect of his philosophy does not change fundamentally. Kunstverkets upprinnelse, the origin of the work of art. Very freely explained, the artwork gathers cultural meanings, and further, in the presence of the work of art, the world that is, the lived world or culture embedded in our life, is revealed. Most of the time it does not reveal itself due to its familiarity. But art creates space for truth in this sense. A certain type of dynamics of covering and uncovering or revealing is exposed. Philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty moves the focus to the body as the reference point of understanding the world. Not the body as opposed to the mind. He does not support a dualistic view, but he wishes to challenge some of the ways Western philosophy has been placing consciousness at the center of discussion, as the main source of knowledge. As opposed to saying, I have a body, he says, I am a body. The way in which we are in this world is embodied. He uses the example of running in a football field. You are not only located in the field, but the field reveals itself to you as a result of your intentions and goals, the positions, everything that is going on. Kroppens Phenomenology by Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenology of the body or perception. Including the body in phenomenological discussion is relevant for many art forms, since it reveals the way an artist is always already in the world as an embodied agent. For example, with an instrument, the phenomenological approach challenges Collingwood's view, or any view that says that artworks simply communicate ideas. I also want to mention R. Murray Schafer's book, The Soundscape. This one. It is not a book about phenomenology, but a good source as a supplement if you want to apply thoughts from phenomenology to different types of sound art, acousmatic music, or sound installations. Schafer describes acoustic environments, changes in soundscapes through history, from the rural society through the Industrial Revolution to the cities, changes in interpretations of sounds, and what meanings the sounds are coded with. They were first meant to frighten evil spirits, and they were a community signal, attracting and unifying a community. Don Ede's book, Listening and Voice, The Phenomenologies of Sound, connects phenomenology to the dramaturgy and musicality of the spoken word, among other things. The book is very well written. It discusses other historical phenomenologists and creates its own perspective relevant to music. He writes that listening begins from the body already being present in this world. A point that has been missing in earlier phenomenology is understanding language and voice as being embodied, having their basis in breath and the dramaturgy of voice. Even a single inhale expresses a multitude of meanings. The center of language is, however, difficult to locate in the voice, since this is so familiar to us. This center is ignored because it is what is closest to us. Our attention turns away towards what is in front of us, the already formed meanings of words. A final philosopher I want to mention in this chapter is Hans-Georg Gadamer, associated with hermeneutic philosophy. This philosophy has inherited a lot from phenomenology, but has its emphasis on understanding and interpreting, in many cases, a text. But hermeneutics can concern other things too. An interesting idea of Gadamer is his concept of prejudice, of the pre-knowledge and pre-attitudes that we, ourselves, bring to a situation when we, for example, read a text. You don't just absorb the text from a blank slate, but you bring yourself, your horizon of understanding to the situation. This is, of course, applicable to music as well. This is a precondition to understanding. It is not something that stands in the way of understanding. So, prejudice, which as a word is often negatively loaded, is necessary in the process of interpreting and understanding. Gadamer is not a philosopher of music, but this discussion of interpretation is relevant to music too. Critical perspectives. Music is not innocent. We have already discussed many critical perspectives. In this chapter, I want to mention a few further topics and make suggestions for further reading. These suggestions fall in different ways under the statement "music is not innocent." First, if you want to read more about the institutionalization of the art music field, especially since Romanticism, about absolute music, the aesthetic discussions, etc., you could read Karl Dahlhaus' The Idea of Absolute Music. This one. Or Mark Evan Bond's Absolute Music, A History of an Idea. This one. I also recommend Lydia Goer's The Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, already mentioned before. Goer describes the institutionalized field and practice of classical music, what is involved in the composition, reception and performance of this music. Why do people behave in certain ways in the concert room? Goer also describes how the audience that listens repeatedly to the same work, for example Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, recognizes the melodies like, that one. The fact that the musical work will always exist creates the illusion that the world is in good order, she writes. There will always be that theme. This can be interesting to read in parallel with William Weber's The Great Transformation of Musical Taste. He analyzes certain programming from the past few centuries and makes the point that the hegemony of certain repertoire was reached after 1850. It might be later than we often assume. Sometimes we naively assume that the history has simply picked out the great masterworks for us, without social conventions playing any role in it. We shortly discussed Adorno's critical theory and the mythical fear or anxiety of the modern human beings that has become extreme, and how this has resulted in the need to have perfect control of what is considered real. The reasoning and even experiencing has become circular. This Adorno calls identity thinking. Reality is forced into identity with the existing ideas. If there is any hope in the modern situation, music carries this hope, because it is not reductive to the means-ends reasoning. It points towards the possibility of the unknown. Yet this fact is hidden, and on the surface, music too presents itself as something with clear contours, something finished and unproblematic. Perhaps the need to consider musical works as clear and recognizable, belonging to a repertoire that is performed repeatedly, a musical canon, is also an expression of this anxiety. Perhaps the music that the audience listens to in the concert hall matches with their ideas and expectations, and is therefore experienced as safe. A further question is where this leaves contemporary music, new art music composed today and perhaps the past 70 years. In many ways, contemporary music takes further the heritage of the Romantic music, but at the same time it has distanced itself from many of the values and structures of Romanticism. Contemporary music cannot really be defined as a musical style, but perhaps as a musical domain or an area. It has struggled finding its place in society, and it has even become to some extent marginalized, since it has had the need to distance itself from some of the value systems of society. We already discussed the difficulty to explain the value of a music that does not have any direct use value, not even as entertainment. The way this music is exploring, the way it requires expertise from the composers and performers, and the way it requires full focus from the audience in a time when the concentration span gets shorter and shorter, does not suit very well the quick fix culture and hedonistic world today. Rose R. Subotnick is an important voice in critical theory. She has interpreted Adorno's writing further. She discusses the situation of contemporary music, art music composed in recent times, the norms and expectations of this music, and the expectations of the listener, a focused listening occupied with the inner movements and structures. She claims that the isolation of contemporary music as a field is a symptom of some of the contradictions in the cultural value system. This is a huge discussion, and we will not go deeper into it. You will perhaps learn more about it by reading writings of composers and musicians themselves, and some musicologists who actively discuss musical modernism. The typical jargon of philosophy of music does not, to the same extent, discuss the critical perspectives of contemporary music or the history of ideas, how music reacts to the ideas of the time it belongs to. Now, let us return to the phrase "music is not innocent" and discuss this in a slightly other context, the agency of the composers and musicians, including their social backgrounds. This title I have adapted from the expression timbral innocence by John Shepherd. Timbral innocence describes the assumption of pureness of classical music within the harmonic rhythmic framework. In classical music, this takes the form of standardized purity. According to Shepherd, this compensates for the instability and fullness of timbre, the materiality of sound, which cannot be notated in the same way. This has resulted in the assumption that timbre itself, in classical music, is neutral. It is considered innocent. It is simply an expressive quality of the music. Shepherd writes about it in one of the chapters in this book, Music and Society, The Politics of Composition, Performance and Reception. In other art forms, the topic of who defines the use of a material has been studied for a longer time. In writing, for example, questions have been raised about how certain norms have been formed. Is whiteness, for example, being a white Western writer, relevant for how the standards of writing have been defined? Another example is filmmaking. How does gender affect filmmaking and the visual ideals of this art form? Susan McLary is among the first musicologists to make the point that this critical discussion has not been present in music to the same extent. This she discusses in her work Feminine Endings. Susanna Välimäki is another musicologist to study this topic in her article on a lesbian relationship with music, a serious effort not to think straight. The criticism of some of the institutionalized features of the Western traditions of art music does mostly not emerge from the armchair philosophy, but from those who are part of a certain field, experiencing the social world and having a direct or indirect experience about something not being quite right. This pushes them to study the situation and to do research about the historical and contemporary structures around music. I would like to return to Arendt's philosophy and her productive point that the thinking activity that happens in the space between individuals, between their different experiences, is necessary for the thinking itself to develop. Though if we apply this to musical norms, we need to understand thinking in a wider sense that includes artistic practice too. Critical studies are not there to annihilate all the existing practice. Rather, criticism is necessary for a field to develop, remain vital, relevant, and to flourish. Understood in this way, music can also be an important area of negotiation of meaning between social groups and individuals. This is a point that Richard Schusterman also makes. Let us have a look at an example, an article published in a Finnish newspaper in 2019. The paper itself is in Swedish. This is an article by musicologist Susanna Välimäki titled "The Symfoniorkestra is the final haven of patriarkal culture." The article comments the gender imbalance of musical repertoire performed by symphony orchestras today. One of her main points is that the music history itself has not been that biased, that there has been a lot of women composers throughout history, but the history writing and programming has been biased. Susanna Välimäki and Nuppu Koivisto-Kaasik have recently published this book, Sävelten, tyttäret. It presents 126 Finnish women composers from the 19th to 20th century. They actually found many more but could not fit everything in one book. The book was published in 2023 and it is available online for free. I put a link down below. Final words. Philosophy of music as a discipline is not an authority that has the final word about music and its functions. Several of the philosophers do not have a professional education in music, nor necessarily specific knowledge about music history and the history of ideas in music. Not all of them know that much about music theory either, the changes that have happened in theoretical thinking throughout time. The philosophers do not necessarily have specialized knowledge about the historical development of musical notation, instrumental practice, or how the roles of musicians, composers, and other actors have changed over time. Or they do not necessarily have the experience of the messy process of musical composition, a lot of which could be interpretational work. Also, they have not necessarily been present in art politics. They have not sat at meetings where you have to try to find arguments for the existence of music that does not generate much economic profit. They do not necessarily know how it is partly financially determined what music gets to exist in the first place. Yet the philosophy of music forms theories about music, and once things are articulated as a theory, they come across as an authority somehow. On some occasions, theories might even do violence to the musical practice itself. Now, as presented, there are a lot of different directions within the philosophy of music. Both those that begin their thinking from an 18th and 19th century classical framework and those who do consider society, politics and historical development as a central part of the discussion. I hope that you have found some useful sources in this video. If you want to have a deeper dive into the research of the philosophy of music, I recommend choosing one source that describes the field in general and reading that one source properly. You could make notes about each of the thinkers and traditions referred to. Later you will recognize that the same names come up repeatedly in different sources. However, the philosophers of music presented in this video are only a selection. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing to my channel. And that was Philosophy of Music in 100 plus 12 minutes plus 37 seconds.